Okay, let's get us started for today. Thank you everyone for being with us today and for joining us at this virtual event that's happening at the sidelines of the multi-stakeholder hearing of the 4th Financing for Development Conference, which is titled Leveling the Playing Field, How Company Transparency Drives Financing for Development. I am very honored to be moderating this panel with leading experts on anti-corruption, fiscal justice, and international development. My name is Agustina. I am Senior Advocacy Manager at Open Ownership, which is the global center of expertise on beneficial ownership. For those that are not familiar with the concept, when we talk about beneficial ownership, we refer to the physical people that own, control, or benefit from corporate vehicles, such as companies, trusts, or other legal arrangements. We work on gathering evidence, developing policy thinking and recommendations, and providing direct technical assistance to governments working on such reforms in a way that they are well implemented and servicing the needs of each country. Companies are embedded into all aspects of society, and they can be crucial for investing in sustainable development and ensuring human rights. So transparency over company ownership is an essential building block of a fair financial system. It's a foundation element to curb corruption, money laundering, and tax evasion, key 3 areas that hinder economic and social development as they facilitate illicit financial flows that prevent the investment where it's most needed. But at the same time, they can be engines for development. They can be allies in enforcing progressive tax policies and mobilizing domestic resources, accelerating sustainable development in an inclusive and accountable way. So today, honoring the Financing for Development process and the conference that will be happening next year in Spain, we are gathering leading experts to reflect just on how corporate vehicles, through beneficial ownership transparency, can support the Financing for Development objectives and its key areas, where the information of who owns and controls companies is actively used to guide decision-making, reduce risk, and detect wrongdoing. I am being joined by 4 fantastic panelists, which you'll have the pleasure of hearing from in the next hour and a half or so. We have Carrie Ann Lucas. She is Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Officer at the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, the UNODC. We have Emmanuel Nweke. He is the Minister Counselor on Drugs, Crime, and Human Rights at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Nigeria. We have Francis Cairo. He's policy advisor at the Tax Justice Network Africa, and he's replacing Chennai, who couldn't make it for today. Thank you, Francis, for joining us on a very short notice. And Camilo Cetina, who is principal specialist at the Digital Transformation Unit of the Latin American Development Bank, or CAF. So for those that are in the room, you'll see there's a Q&A section below where you can leave your comments or your questions for the panelists. There's a chat option as well where you can leave your thoughts or topics that resonate with you. But we will also encourage you to raise your hand if you want to directly intervene. So you have the option to raise the hand directly in the, I think this there at the bottom of the meeting, and we can bring you in to the panelist section to directly share your thoughts and intervene on some of the topics and questions that we will be discussing, and to keep it interactive and really reflective of the topics that people care the most. So housekeeping being covered, and without any further delay, let's jump directly into the session. So we're going to start with a very broad question, which I'll ask each of the panelists to respond in around 3 to 4 minutes. Around what do you think are the areas that the 4th Financing for Development Conference should focus on, and how can these support transparent and accountable investment in development? So, Carrie, do you want to start to kick us off?
I'd love to. And thanks so much. It's really wonderful to be here with distinguished colleagues on this panel. So I think anti-corruption is a key area the conference should focus on because of the insidious ways that corruption infiltrates our systems and our institutions and facilitates other crimes. And if we want to strengthen our allyship with corporate vehicles in securing financing for development, we have to work to also address their challenges. And one of the biggest is corruption. A business environment that's perceived as corrupt acts as a significant deterrent to investment. Companies are less likely to engage in economies where corruption, bribes, and favoritism influence business decisions because it leads to unpredictable costs and substantial legal risks. So reducing corruption is essential for attracting investors, which can enhance revenue generation and stimulate economic growth. So in this regard, we'd really like to see the conference emphasize the power of proven anti-corruption measures, things like codes of conduct, conflict of interest policies, whistleblower protection, and internal controls and audits. All of these can help mitigate corruption risks and establish an enabling environment that attracts investment. Setting out strong foreign bribery legislation with clear enforcement measures, as well as incentives and rewards for companies that act ethically and are transparent in their business practices is also important. Public procurement is another great example where open contracting standards and clear regulations can help foster greater transparency and fair competition. Procurement rules that reward companies that commit to and implement anti-corruption policies help make ethical behavior a competitive advantage. And investors and investment funds should also be encouraged to divest from companies involved in large-scale corruption and require companies that they invest in to annually report on their anti-corruption progress. This would help to leverage market power and mobilize resources for development. But I have to emphasize one particular anti-corruption measure, which of course is the subject of today's panel, but really is essential to transparent and accountable investment, and that's beneficial ownership transparency. To enable entities to mitigate risks of engaging with corrupt partners and enhance integrity and transparency throughout their own supply chain so that they can engage in accountable investments, beneficial ownership information should be made available to help corporate vehicles make informed decisions. And as a complement, stronger beneficial ownership screening should be in place for all companies operating in high-risk sectors, for example, like the extractive sector, to prevent the misuse of corporate networks for illegal activities. And in fact, establishing effective beneficial ownership registers is a proven reform mechanism that enhances clarity among the ultimate owners and those who control companies. So this requires solid legal frameworks, high quality data collection, and information to be shared between relevant actors and systematically used. So it's not enough that we have beneficial ownership information, we have to be using it for anti-corruption efforts. And structured and interoperable data sets can help us facilitate this information sharing, and when combined with strong reporting mechanisms, can prevent and mitigate losses before they occur. So we'd really like to see many of these examples, especially beneficial ownership transparency, throughout the upcoming conference and the outcome document, because we know how powerful anti-corruption measures can be to support transparent and accountable investment, and they simply haven't been sufficiently addressed in the past. Thanks.
Thank you, Kari. Emmanuel, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for organizing this interaction. I think that it is timely. First, financing for development is one of the most important global issues with its different impacts on different jurisdictions. And we think that financing for development is dwindling, and many developing countries are grappling with the effect of mobilizing resources for sustainable development. And that is why we think that it's timely that we are also having this conversation. And we think that this issue is not only important and being discussed at the global level, it's also playing a key role in the discourse at the regional and as well as the domestic level. But first, we could recall the Addis Ababa Action Agenda that was one of the outcomes of the International Conference on Financing for Development, the third, I think. And you saw how African leaders and global leaders felt there was need to ensure that resources are aligned to development issues. And we also now look at how you can combat corruption at not only domestic level, but at international level to be able to free some of these assets that are needed for these development endeavors. But we think that besides what we can achieve in fighting corruption, and particularly through beneficial ownership disclosures, we also think that there are key fundamental issues that require to be addressed at the global level. For instance, if you listen to many global leaders who addressed United Nations during the high-level segment only last month, most developing countries representatives, particularly their leaders, regretted, that they are spending almost twice the budget for health and education servicing debt. And that also led to several calls by these leaders for a restructuring of the international financial architecture. And we think that resources that could be saved from fighting corruption at the domestic level through some of the measures that we try to highlight with regard to beneficial ownership transparency could also be supported by a United Nations system or an international system that is fair and is inclusive, that also supports their role in providing support for development engagement, perhaps in developing countries. So from our side, it is good that we are fighting corruption, and it's good that we are developing strong structures at the domestic level to address issues of beneficial ownership transparency. But we think also that attention should equally be paid in other areas where these resources could be mobilized to address this issue. For instance, we are just barely 6 years away from the target date for the SDG. And we learned that there's an estimate that will require about 5.4 to 6.4 trillion US dollars to be able to achieve the SDG target in the next 6 years. These resources may not be able to be achieved by mainly depending on what could be mobilized by addressing all of these gaps at the domestic level. This also gives strong support for the call to ensure that we restructure the international financial architecture. And also similar to that is the issue of how do you get the global north and the global south to begin to find that common balance to ensure that commitments made to support efforts for this development financing are implemented and are carried out by those who have made them. For instance, you look at the issues with regard to the climate change. Since the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, there has been several commitments, particularly the recent being the COP27 in Egypt, where the United Nations also adopted the Loss and Damages Fund to support climate change challenges disaster. You notice that since then, that fund has not been operationalized. And developing countries who may require these resources to improve their situation, do not have access to them. And that poses a lot of challenges. So besides what we can do with the fight against corruption at the domestic level and through beneficial ownership transparency, we think there is a strong need to also address the key fundamental imbalance at the global level with regard to financing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Very, very important items which we'll come back to. Camilo, do you want to continue?
Okay, thank you, Agustina. Well, I'll start by saying that from my point of view, we don't have corruption here in Latin America. What we have is organized crime trying to predate money out of the taxpayers. Really, those are big networks that we need to fight against, and that's why it has been proven to be a very difficult problem here, a policy problem. So what I will say is from the regional development bank's point of view, we could effectively help to incorporate beneficial ownership transparency reforms, and we would love as well to see this international conference on financing for development to talk about at least 3 main aspects. One is policy alignment and technical assistance. that is given to these developing countries. Well, and what I'm trying to say here is that we have to work closely with member countries to align to, beneficial transparency requirements with broader anti-corruption, fiscal integrity, and sustainable development goals, financing objectives. So we need to provide technical support and capacity building, and also help national institutions with the skills and frameworks to implement these transparency or beneficial ownership transparency reforms, that because this is pretty, at least in Latin America, this is pretty new. If you check, I mean, like all across the region, at least 10 or 14, maybe in the best of the cases, in the best case scenario, 14 countries have some legislation, but it's pretty new. So I think the oldest one comes from Uruguay and Argentina, which has beneficial ownership, legislations from 2018. But afterwards, it tries to trickle down across the continent. But that's pretty new, right? So we need to actually provide those institutions with the frameworks and the skills to implement that kind of legislation. Well, the other thing I think should be data and reporting standards. By establishing robust data sharing and reporting standards, we can promote transparent cross-border financial activities. This ensures that financial transactions, for instance, within and between member countries of the banks or in the United Nations systems, meet the standards necessary to trace ownership and prevent illicit financial flows. And that will help in turn governments to safeguard resources intended, to be allocated for sustainable development goals, right? And the third line, I will say, is incentivizing compliance. So we can create an incentive structure for countries to adopt beneficial ownership transparency practices, such as linking financial eligibility or favorable terms to progress on transparency reforms. And that this can be achieved by incorporating, beneficial ownership indicators into loan agreements or financing conditions that will promote adherence to these standards in exchange for development support. And that should be widely discussed across the conference. I'm not sure if that's going to be the case, but that kind of incentive should be provided to the developing world, in order to make the conference work better and complement these efforts by reinforcing beneficial ownership transparency as a critical enabler for financing the sustainable development goals. That's it. I will keep it there. Thank you very much.
Great opening remarks to unpack in subsequent answers. Francis, over to you as our last speaker of the first round. What do you think are the key areas that the FfD process should focus on?
Yeah, thank you, and welcome to all the participants, and good to meet my fellow panelists. Representing Chennai here, and happy to be among other peers. I think one of the things that we are seeking to see is how, for example, the outcome document will comprehensively speak about the barriers towards redoing financing for development in this decade moving forward. And these barriers, I think other colleagues have spoken about them. It is number one, about the global rules that do not work for the global south. It is also about balancing the interests of developing vis-a-vis developed countries. It's about allowing participation, not at the point of endorsement of rules and agreements, but also allowing the participation of all countries at the point of discussing which rules need to be on the agenda. That's the agenda setting, but also discussing the frame of the rules, discussing the applicability of the rules, and ensuring that any rules that we come up with around, for example, how we will do exchange of information moving forward, either tax information or beneficial ownership information, how we will hold each other to account. How each, one country will be able to hold others to account. all these agreements, how they are discussed, the involvement and participation of everyone on board is going to be very key. And I hope that this is one of the principles that is also going to be captured in the outcome document moving forward. But I think the other thing that I might also want to add is that in previous FFD conferences, there was, especially the Addis Ababa one, if you look at the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, there was a very clear acknowledgement on the need for a global agreement that really guides international tax cooperation. We are at a point now globally where we are discussing that, and we hope that through the FFD4 process, we will see a reiteration of the importance of having, you know, a new framework that allows better tax cooperation moving forward, and especially being able to see the principles espoused, the principles, for example, around the need to improve international tax cooperation, the need to overhaul the international financial and tax architecture. And I know that colleagues on the call will also want me to add overhauling the international debt architecture. It's also about enabling an equitable approach to rules, the formulation of rules, the applicability of rules, and ensuring that the rules that we do come up with that guide, for example, how we do international tax cooperation, how we exchange data better moving forward, how we tackle, for example, tax havens, all these discussions and these agreements, having an equitable approach that allows us to relook at how we will do financing for development moving forward, I think is one of the things that we need to see. I think I must also add that the scourge of illicit financial flows has continued growing. I know we will dig deeper into this as we continue with the conversation, but being able to reflect, you know, an approach that allows us to tackle the drivers, the destinations, the enablers, all this needs to be captured and needs to come out very clearly as we move forward. I also would also want to add that I know I have had a colleague speak about, you know, how we look at multinationals and the ownership of multinationals. And I think moving forward, how we tax multinationals is increasingly important in redesigning how we actually do financing models. As you know very well, multinationals have contributed towards, you know, this great scourge of illicit financial flows, the lack of tax transparency.
Oh, Francis, I think we lost you. Very, very interesting points that Francis was providing us. So maybe we can come back to him when he's back with us. I think he's still frozen. Okay, yeah, Are you with us, Francis? Okay, no, I think his connection has dropped. So let's follow up and come back to these very, very important items when he rejoins. Thank you for your excellent open remarks. I think you've touched on many, many important issues, which we unfortunately won't have the time to dig as they deserve in this conversation. But I think that they are all quite important to be flagged in the different engagements through the FFT process. So let's jump into. I have specific questions for each of you to continue discussing what you've started to surface. Emmanuel, if I may go to you, you represent the Nigerian government, which is a global leader on beneficial ownership transparency. You've launched the first African full economy beneficial ownership register in 2020 with disclosures made by over 600,000 companies to date. And you yourself, you have long-standing work on anti-corruption and international development. So what are the expectations of the government of Nigeria of this process? And what do you think the FFD process poses a tremendous opportunity to doubling efforts on this area? There you are, sorry.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. I think I feel a sense of pride with regard to what we have achieved with our beneficial ownership register. And if you recall, before that high number of disclosures by the Corporate Affairs Commission in Nigeria, we had a situation where the Nigeria Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative had also done extensive job in the extractive industry, trying to provide information of beneficial owners of legal persons and legal arrangements in Nigeria. And this has actually helped the country to reduce corruption to the barest minimum, because information about the beneficial interest of politically exposed persons, as well as ownership of companies, are known and made available to other domestic competent authorities with regard to how they investigate issues of corruption and how they are able to check data across the levels of government and appreciate where corruption is taking place, and how we also able to reduce to the barest minimum the flow of illicitly acquired assets from Nigeria out to outside Nigeria. And I think that since this process began, there's always been a deliberate effort to see how we could improve. What are we doing with information that we have? How are we making sure that it's available to not only our domestic competent authorities, but to other competent authorities elsewhere, so that we can facilitate cross-border corruption investigation, as well as efforts to recover and return proceeds of crimes. But to our mind and to the feelings of the government of Nigeria, and indeed many other developing countries, we think that while effort is focused, in addressing these challenges at the domestic level, we think that there is much more we could also do, just like the last speaker mentioned, by restructuring the international financial architecture. And I'm indeed happy that a pact for the future, which was adopted by the whole of the international community at the high level of the section of the United Nations General Assembly, had extensive provisions on how we should begin to address issues of imbalance between the global south and global north, to ensure that we have resources available to address development concern in developing countries. So Nigeria see a huge opportunity in trying to consider where the gap exists, and then trying to narrow this gap and ensure that these needed resources are made available, so that they will complement what we are able to mobilize because of our efforts in addressing corruption through beneficial ownership disclosure at the domestic level. And like I mentioned earlier, if you are having a conversation, perhaps at the global level, where you still find countries who are opposed to any efforts for the global community to perhaps elaborate a new framework convention on tax that will actually promote inclusivity, ensure fair play, and equally help the developing countries to have access to as fair, not as many, but fair tax returns that is due to them, which are made available for development issues, then that tells you that there is much more to be done to get the global community to actually come to the understanding that these are challenges that should be taken very seriously. And I hope that the next conference coming up in Spain will actually become a building plan on what has been agreed in the Pact for the Future, and ensure that we are able to address these concerns. One may ask, when we look at the global financial institutions, for instance, the World Bank and the IMF, one may ask who are those who influence how the IMF comes up with its policies and budget for development programs in developing countries. It's obvious that those who control these institutions are able to decide where funds are allocated. And because developing countries do not have that influence and do not control the structure of these institutions, they find themselves at the mercy of what the global north thinks, how they think they can be supported. That is why we are years away from our target for the SDG And when you look at the gap, you'll appreciate that there is a long way to go. And indeed, that was why my country was among those who had called for extension of the SDG beyond 2030 to ensure that we are able to meet these targets that will narrow the gap, the widening gap between the global north and global south. So I would like to conclude by restating that our efforts in terms of our beneficial ownership transparency has been yielding a lot of results in various sectors of our economy, in public procurement, in the way that government distributes available resources, ensuring that those who benefit, for instance, for an agri resources, are those who should benefit because information about the beneficial owners are known. And if there are, politically exposed persons who are involved, government is able to address this issue. We think that all of these efforts is yielding positive results, but there is need to ensure there is a complement from the international community in restructuring the system that we operate now and ensure that we have a more inclusive and fair international financial regime, as well as a tax system that benefits all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emmanuel. very important points to consider on, and Nigeria being a leading country in the region and on these topics can really drive the conversation forward on these. And continuing on that line, I want to jump to Carrie now, who the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes oversees the implementation of the UNCAC, which is the convention, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And in your opening remarks, you mentioned corruption being like the cross-cutting issue that should be accounted for in FfD process, and the UNCAC being the main convention internationally that ensures that countries can have tools to prevent and combat corruption. So how do you think both processes speak with each other, and what are the biggest challenges that we're facing now that FfD can help to address?
Thank you so much. What I'll say won't come as a surprise, but fast-tracking anti-corruption action is our biggest challenge. So we have 191 states parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption. So absolutely, countries are taking action under this framework, but there's still a lot of work to be done to prevent and counter corruption. And I'll sort of go through some of our key challenges and then provide what we're hoping the Financing for Development Conference can address. So corrupt officials and criminals, as we know, often transfer illicitly acquired wealth out of developing countries, depriving them of critical resources needed for sustainable development. The outflow of illicit funds and money laundering, to which corruption is often linked, poses significant challenges. There's strong evidence linking anonymously owned companies, corruption, and illicit financial flows. Over 70% of corruption cases in the last few decades have involved the use of these entities, many of which remain hidden. And criminals exploit inconsistent interagency and international collaboration, which hinders effective detection and prosecution. And while we know that the return of proceeds of corruption can fill a critical resourcing gap, challenges in the successful recovery and return of assets continue, including due to a lack of capacity and resources, differences in legal systems, complex requirements for cooperation, and truly just the difficulty in identifying and detecting stolen assets. And while settlements are increasingly used in asset recovery and return, a significant gap remains between the amounts realized in those settlements and those that are ultimately returned to countries. Tax reforms, as many of our panelists have mentioned, are vital for increasing domestic resource mobilization, but corruption stands out as one of the primary obstacles to broadening the tax base. So empirical studies since the 90s have underscored that the impact of tax reform on a country's financial capacity is intricately linked to the extent of corruption control. So reducing corruption globally could increase tax revenues by about $1 trillion or 1.25% of global GDP. Corruption in public service delivery directly impacts citizens' willingness to pay taxes and erodes their trust in government institutions. And this decline in trust kind of fuels a vicious cycle where it then leads to higher levels of tax avoidance and evasion, ultimately reducing domestic resource mobilization. When corruption infiltrates aid programs, it siphons vital resources away from beneficiaries, severely undermining the objectives of those initiatives. And this not only stalls progress in areas like healthcare and education and infrastructure, but it also jeopardizes the very trust and support that's needed. Development aid is often dispersed through public procurement systems, both in donor and beneficiary countries, which are at high risk of conflicts of interest and collusion. And corruption acts as a deterrent to the private sector in making required investments in the net zero transition. So meaning the balance between the amount of greenhouse gases that's produced and the amount that's removed from the atmosphere. The latest report from the UN Environmental Program, released just this month, estimated that global investments between 1 and 2.1 trillion US dollars per year are needed from now until 2050 in this regard. So how do we address all of these really big systemic challenges that we see? The first, and I sort of have to say, but I really believe this, is that the UN Convention Against Corruption, with 191 states parties, it provides the only global framework for addressing corruption. The implementation review mechanism under the convention has been active since 2010, and it offers valuable insights into challenges and good practices that countries are facing. And if we can implement the outcomes from the review mechanism, especially on articles like beneficial ownership transparency and procurement, we can better mobilize and safeguard the funds needed for financing for development. To effectively address illicit financial flows, we have to foster interagency and international cooperation. We can leverage existing networks like the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative and the Global Operational Network of Law Enforcement Anti-Corruption Authorities to help identify potential corruption cases and ensure that information is shared with multiple countries at the same time. This, combined with removing legal and administrative barriers between relevant agencies and across countries, would help to ensure effective information sharing. When introducing tax reforms, it's important to ensure that they're complemented by strong anti-corruption measures. UNODC will be holding a series of regional meetings, bringing together anti-corruption and tax authorities. And our hope and aim is that such meetings can help address tax reform and cooperation between these entities, and also maybe feed into and complement discussions on tax frameworks, as mentioned by Francis. Corrupt actors move proceeds quickly across borders, and we have to ensure that our domestic and international systems are equipped to prevent and mitigate these opportunities by calling for stronger interagency frameworks, cooperation like Emmanuel was mentioning, and interoperable systems, things like standardized open data, including those that hold tax, procurement, and BO information. Such authorities should really work together in oversight and enforcement. So for example, failing to declare beneficial ownership information could render an entity ineligible to bid on procurement contracts, and an entity that is engaging in tax evasion could be debarred, for example. Effective laws that support access to information are also key to ensure that the public can scrutinize decisions and ensure that interest groups who might influence policies and decision-making are undertaking their work ethically. So including these ideas in the outcome document and in the conference will both complement the framework that's already set out by the UN Convention Against Corruption, but can also help us build momentum to fast-track anti-corruption action. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. I love the shift between not only addressing challenges, but specifically talking about concrete ideas in which these could be tackled and very much considered to include in the conversations and in the outcome document. So let's get back to them and ensure that they're well addressed. Thanks so much. And so continuing with this line on how corruption prevents like broadening the tax base and the importance of the international tax architecture, the current status, and what CSOs, civil society organizations, have been pushing for the reform. I want to go back to Francis, which had to drop at the end of his last intervention. So Francis, if you want to finish your idea of that, feel free to do so. And also tying to this round of questions around the tax justice network has been really pushing for not only reforming the international tax architecture, but encouraging to have better progressive tax systems. So how do you think the FfD process is key in achieving these, and how do beneficial ownership transparency reforms can help to support these?
Thank you. And my apologies. Network decided to do that thing. And so my apologies for having to drop out and then come back in. One of the things that I was building some thoughts on are the key issues that concern all of us, especially when it comes to what are the main issues that people are pushing for when it comes to reforms. One, people are pushing, and this is civil society, organizations, and most players have been pushing, we need to overhaul how we tax the wealthy. How do we do that? We need data on who do we consider wealthy? Where are they holding their wealth? How do we distinguish between one person and the other, one entity and the other? Beneficial ownership comes in. But secondly, we also need to have an international facilitative set of rules that allows us to be able to reach that wealth, either for purposes of doing the tax assessment, and therefore one country being able to request for that information from another country and being able to get it, or for example, an authority that is responsible for the recovery of assets, being able to trace and recover assets. And therefore, you keep seeing this thread between, though we say how we tax the wealthy, then it is tied to beneficial ownership transparency. It is tied to the exchange of information for tax purposes and financial purposes. It is tied to the international facilitative set of rules. And these very key connections are what we are having this good discussion about today. But secondly, it's also about multinationals. As you know very well, multinationals have what me and you do not have, the ability to choose domicile very easily. And therefore, where you see one country trying to work alone, setting up their systems, ensuring that their system is working better, ensuring that they have greater transparency. If that system does not speak with other systems, then countries or other companies or multinationals will very easily move from one country to the other and go to a place where they find more secrecy. They are able to find a facilitative environment for the movement of capital in and out. They are able to find covering, so they know very well that, for example, when it comes to tax assessments, they get taxless. And this has led to countries almost engaging in some form of very harmful tax competition. And therefore, to the extent that countries can continue working together in concert, it makes it easier to beat multinationals at their game. But one country working alone will not be able to make it. And therefore, these are some of the principles that I believe that within the FfD4 process and the outcome document and the involvement of the different partners, that we can be able to get a good agreement on how we handle that moving forward. But also, it's also about ensuring that reforms at the national level are coupled with reforms at the international level that are facilitative of better outcomes at the domestic level. It is not enough to have a good tax code as a country. It is not enough to come up with a better mining fiscal regime as one country. It is not enough for one country to design a system on how it's going to tax M&Es, for example, within the mining sector. Countries still need to work together, either because of existing double taxation agreements or existing agreements that, for example, talk about customs protocols and all that. And this need for countries to continue working together, I believe, continues to give more impetus to the FfD4 process. And we therefore believe that as countries continue to discuss, as they continue to work together, they start prioritizing the issues that need to be captured in the outcome document, these issues need to also be coupled with these principles to ensure that we have better outcomes for everyone. Developed and developing countries should have better outcomes out of this. Let me also add that in this process, civil society has also been involved, but we are also requesting that civil society must be deeper involved. How? Number one, in pushing these issues that we are pushing for, require a lot of research, require a lot of evidence gathering and evidence building. They require a lot of advocacy. They require a lot of scenario casting. And this cannot be done by one civil society working alone. And therefore, to the extent that the multiplicity of civil society partners, those that are working on tax transparency, those that are working on tax justice, those that are working on beneficial ownership, those that are working on anti-corruption, will continue working together more closely to generate more evidence that can be used to inform our positions in these negotiations, that can be able to inform country positions in the negotiations, the more success that we will seek to see. Let me pause here and allow any other additions that colleagues may have.
Thank you very much, Francis. Very, very clear points, and the importance of multi-stakeholder collaboration throughout the process in which CSOs can be allies to governments in the negotiations, as well as pushing for reforms. I want to remind our attendees that there is a Q&A section, which I already see there is one question. Feel free to leave more. We want to encourage as much as interaction as possible, so you can leave your questions or raise your hand directly if you want to jump in, become a panelist, and share your own thoughts and asks for the FfD process, either if it's related to beneficial ownership transparency or more broadly. So to finish this first round of targeted questions, I want to jump to Camilo, who had already started to talk about the role of the development banks in the financing of the Sustainable Development Goals, around capacity building, about financing systemic reforms, and the importance of data and reporting standards. How do you think that beneficial ownership transparency reforms come within all of these objectives, and how is CAF approaching to that in the FfD process?
Okay, thank you, Lucina. Well, I'm working from, I want to make that clear. I'm working for the Digital Transformation Directorate at CAF, Development Bank of Latin America. So that's the main approach that we have to these anti-corruption issues and anti-corruption and public integrity policies, right? So what we are trying to make is that to integrate, for instance, beneficial ownership into broader digital public infrastructure agenda, So in order to do this, beneficial ownership data must be part of a larger interoperable system that connects with digital public services, right? And regulatory platforms, sorry. So in order to do this, we want, first of all, to resolve the interoperability problem across governments. So we need to create interoperable digital registers. So beneficial ownership data should be embedded within digital registers that communicate seamlessly with other public data systems, such as tax registries, anti-money laundering platforms, procurement databases. So by structuring beneficial ownership information within a standardized and open data framework, digital systems can easily cross-reference data points across different sectors. And this interoperability enables as well various agencies such as tax authorities, financial intelligence units, procurement bodies to access and verify beneficial ownership data efficiently. And then we can enhance detections of, suspicious activities and reduce, some redundancies in data collection, which is a problem here. The other point in the agenda that we are trying to lead here from CAF is the digital identity agenda. So in this case, digital identity as an application for beneficial ownership, if we assign unique digital identifiers to beneficial owners, that allows beneficial ownership data to be easily linked across multiple platforms, from financial transactions to government contracts, for instance. So this approach can streamline data searches and data verification and cross-referencing making faster for authorities to identify patterns related to tax evasion, money laundering, conflict of interest, and all sorts of possible or potential corrupt activities, right? Unique identifiers ensure that each beneficial owner's profile is complete, up to date, and accessible to across the board, supporting a comprehensive approach to regulation and law enforcement. Well, I mean, talking about anti-corruption laws. We also want to implement privacy enhancing technologies, or propose to do that. If beneficial ownership data systems are interoperable, then they need to maintain data privacy and security, especially given the sensitive nature of beneficial ownership information, right? And in order to do that, you need to apply some blockchain technologies, for instance, by integrating privacy enhancing technologies such as zero knowledge proofs, for instance. The beneficial ownership systems can allow access to relevant information without exposing the full data sets to every entity that is, that has some interest in cross-reference some points across the agenda or across the identifiers that they need to double check, for instance, right? We also fight for automated reporting and real-time monitoring. This is a little bit simpler if you comply with the previous ones. Embedding beneficial ownership data within digital public infrastructures can facilitate automated real-time monitoring of changes in ownership structures, because they are very dynamic as the market economy is, right? So this kind of data are often manipulated to avoid detection in illicit schemes, so automated alerts for transactions involving high-risk entities or changes in beneficial ownership can be sent to relevant authorities, improving responsiveness to potential financial crimes, for instance. So that's kind of, it's a nice feature that you have, as long as the systems that have structured data and are interoperable, right? And also standardizing and harmonizing data for cross-border collaboration. I mean, that was proven by the Odebrecht case, for instance, in Latin America. Standardization of beneficial ownership data within digital infrastructure across jurisdictions supports cross-border data exchange, enabling collaboration in complex cases of financial crimes involving multiple countries. This harmonization aligns data formats and definitions, for instance, what constitutes a beneficial owner, allowing seamless collaboration among international tax authorities, law enforcement, financial institutions. And then this alignment is particularly important for development banks. Please notice that, because we often operate across borders and we have to assess risks to ensure transparency within multi-country projects that, for instance, integration infrastructure projects that need to be, closely watched. So I will leave it there, to keep very concrete. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Camilo. I feel that you've opened a new area that we could have a webinar in itself, but I think it's really, really important that the digital transformation projects have all these different areas of reform that Carrie was also mentioning at the beginning, around procurement, around climate financing, around corruption or anti-corruption mechanisms, how they can all be integrated within one big platform that can in turn just improve decision making and help to raise red flags and prevent things from occurring rather than fighting from behind. So this is our and development banks have a crucial role in supporting countries in capacity building, in peer learning, peer exchange, and investing in these reforms. So I think that's an area that, even building on the UN Digital Compact that has been recently approved, it brings lots of opportunity to dig deeper and to connect the different conversations happening at the international level to enhance domestic reforms. I want to open up for some questions from the public. So again, please raise your hand if you want to directly intervene orally. But in the meantime, I see there are 2 questions as well. Leave your own if you have others. Going back to Camilo, there's a question to you around your challenging assumption that there is not corruption in Latin America. Do you want to respond to that? The question reads like, how does that statement harmonizes with the 2023 Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, which found that in Latin America and the Caribbean, the lack of independence and transparency of the judiciary promotes corruption and the undue influence of political and economic elites?
Actually, that question, double checks my hypothesis. So what I'm trying to say in a very sarcastic way is that we have a much bigger problem that corruption seems to be, right? So it's not, this is not a case of a couple of politicians who are abusing power and maybe taking, embezzling some money for themselves. That's not the case. Or people who want to abuse for being in public office as long as they are in public office. No, these are huge networks or organized crime trying to predate money out of the taxpayers. And these networks come from both public sector and private sector. And that's what's proven by the Odebrecht case, for instance. Odebrecht had a branch devoted to pay bribes, to make a valuation of the bribe to be paid according to the nature of the infrastructure project that they were supposed to contract, and then to pay the bribe that they need and then embezzle some money for themselves, right? And that was private sector. But the only way for that scheme to be successful was to collude with the public sector in order, to make that crime possible. So what I'm trying to state is we have organized crime here, very complex networks that in which we need to get sophisticated tools to fight against. And that's the case for beneficial ownership transparency, right? So as long as we have this, was I talking about digital identity, interoperability, proper beneficial ownership registries or records, right? Then we are gaining tools to, to fight this kind of organized crime. And of course, the question is right. Justice system is always as well very sometimes inefficient because somehow they are sensitive to collaborate in some jurisdictions with these corrupt networks. So that's what I'm talking about. This is more than corruption. This is organized crime that we're trying to fight, and we need some cooperation across, cross-border cooperation and like stronger institutions, to make this anti-corruption policy a reality. So it's a big problem. That's what I'm trying to state. Thank you.
Thanks, Camilo. Very clear. Kari, from your role at the UNODC, you want to comment as well from even a bigger perspective from other regions?
Yes, definitely. I think that Camilo touches on a really important point in the question, and also does. I think it's become more and more apparent how directly linked corruption and organized crime is. And we can see this, for example, at the last session of the Conference of the States Parties, which is the main policy-making body, the governing body of the UN Convention Against Corruption. So at the last session, which happened in December, just this past year, there was the first ever resolution looking at corruption and organized crime together, and looking at the way that corruption facilitates organized crime, and how important it is to address them in tandem. And so there's going to be some research that is coming out on this probably by the end of next year, where the UN has been mandated to look at the links between corruption and organized crime, and especially best practices concerning international cooperation in this regard and addressing corruption involving organized criminal groups. And so I think, please be on the lookout for this kind of information coming up. And I think it's just going to become a bigger part of our role. And I think here also the networks that I was mentioning, like the GLOBE network, the Global Operational Network of Law Enforcement Anti-Corruption Authorities, that really does allow countries to share information with multiple countries at the same time informally. I think can really, like informally meaning really at a faster pace in a timely manner. I think can also play a really important role in terms of addressing some of these challenges.
Thanks, Carrie. Super clear. I think we have a hand raised from Chris Owala. So you should be able to speak. And please introduce yourself. Where are you joining us from?
Thank you. My name is Chris Owala. I'm Executive Director for Community Initiative Action Group Kenya. I work on the issues of illicit flows, corruption and accountability, and also human rights. I work at cross level, mainly at the lower level, at the sub-national levels. I've been listening keenly here, and I tend to say that the beginning point should be at the county level. We even if they don't do much, but if there's no political will at county level or at the national levels, then we can't stretch much at the continental or regional levels if the national levels are not in a way embracing issue of beneficial ownership. Because you can't start it from far if it's not yet adopted at a national level, but also at regional levels. If you want to strengthen the issue of beneficial ownership, I know UNODC trying, but they are weaker because they work with the state parties. We know any agency that work with state parties in a way might not compel state parties because they get instruction from state parties most of the times. They're like appendix state parties. I might not be wrong, but I tend to think they are like quasi-government agencies. So I'm looking at a situation whereby, how do we strengthen this? Can we work with political bodies like African OAU, for example? Can we work with political bodies like European Union, for example? So that we get the political buy-in. And as we get the political buy-in, can we also strengthen the campaign on beneficial ownership such that the citizen at lower level understand the issue of beneficial ownership? Because many a times we make it a high-ended elite academic discussion, and to the extent that we lose the population that are supposed to hold us accountable of issues of accountability. So we struggle up here, we struggle at international conference, at the global level, but a lot of the population that are supposed to give us the fodder don't understand what we speak. We speak only our language. I think that's where our weakness is, but I'm starting to be corrected. But I think it's a good thing that even at my own level, I've been struggling. How do I make the sub-national government to embed it in their policies and make sure that it's part and parcel of their manifestos? Or can we use during political campaign, like now in the countries that are doing political campaigns, and embed it and make it what we can call political accountability engagement, and tell these leaders that, look, we'll vote for you, we'll support you if you are embracing this beneficial ownership and embed it in your manifesto for us. Thank you. Sorry for taking long.
Thanks, Chris. Very interesting points, and I might ask Emmanuel to comment on that, at least on the political will, being our government representative on the panel.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you to the last speaker. I think I agree with his reasoning that we have to strengthen the institutions at the domestic level, and also strengthen what is being done at the United Nations level. But I also think that sometimes you may have to go from top. What happens at the domestic level, take inspiration from what happens at the United Nations level. I recall that before we had the first resolution at the Conference of State Parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption on Beneficial Ownership Disclosure in 2021 in Sharm el-Sheikh, only a few thought that the activities that are going on at the domestic level were not actually receiving that commensurate support from the UN level, in this case, United Nations Organization on Drugs and Crime, because the UNODC, although we have relevant provisions in the UNCAC, talking about Article 14, Article 12, and Article 51, which provides that state parties shall take measures to ensure regulation of financial institutions, take measures to ensure clear information about politically exposed persons and owners of organizations who deal with government. But there are no concrete efforts to ensure that there is that connection on this particular issue, the way and manner that it is being done now, successively in the subsidiary bodies of the UNODC. We have now have item on the agenda that deals with this issue. Now, this provides a veritable opportunity for those who are experts in this field to share ideas, and from part of the resolution, the operative parts, where state parties were also requested to do certain things, though not binding, but the exchange and then the information which other states share as a way of good practice seems to have a way of influencing others. And you find that if everybody continue to implement this together, we could all grow at the same time. And where you have the United Nations system complementing what happens at the domestic level, it makes the outcomes better. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emmanuel, for your intervention. I think we have one more question before we jump into the last round of almost closing remarks. We have 20 minutes left together. So there's a question to Francis in the chat regarding how does the FfD process, sorry, I'll read it properly. I would love to hear more on what you think are the links between the FfD process and the negotiations for the UN Tax Convention. How can they be leveraged in combination with one another?
Thank you. Such a good question. I think it's also okay if I want to also input on the last input by Chris. So just to add something here, that previously, for a long time, it was easy for one country working alone to, come up with certain rules that applied, within its jurisdiction and within its borders, and see a lot of success. But we are now in a situation where globalization has led to a situation where you have one multinational operating in multiple jurisdictions, or you have one individual who is a beneficial owner of several multinationals operating across, several jurisdictions. And therefore, the need for countries to come together to address global challenges, whether it is corruption, whether it is how we tax multinationals, whether it is even tackling organized crime, because the concept of borders has become, less and less as we have gone along. So, Chris, I agree with you that countries have a lot of work to do, because even if we have international agreements, international rules that are not domesticated, then we will not see any success. But even then, the place of countries working together in concert to develop certain rules and certain agreements and certain procedures is very important, and it will grow in importance as globalization increases, as the concept of borders becomes more and more fluid, and as people start inventing around rules that are developed within jurisdictions. The question on how the two processes, the FfD process and the UN Tax Convention process, are working together, or how they need to be complemented together. One is that we see the FfD4 process as a process that allows countries to get into broad level commitments and establish certain principles that guide how we will move forward when it comes to financing development. So we expect a broad agreement, for example, and broad commitments and member states committing to, for example, how we will review existing tax agreements to make them conform with current issues now. We also expect that countries will commit to tackling illicit financial flows in the ways that they have changed since 2015 at the last FfD conference. We also expect that the challenges of taxing, for example, the wealthy, or taxing multinationals, or exchanging information for tax purposes, or building a digital ID that allows for interoperability, or the ability to, for example, exchange information about individuals and multinationals and similar entities. We expect broad commitments within the FfD4 process and in the outcome document. But in the UN Tax Convention process, we expect firm commitments and rules that countries negotiate and agree upon. So even though there's a broader commitment on how we will, for example, exchange information for financial purposes, the need to have rules that guide which institution is going to be responsible for advancing, for example, a multilateral agreement on the exchange of information for tax purposes. That would come through the UN Tax Convention process. The ability to come up with rules that, for example, guide on the standards that countries need to apply when it comes to the collection of beneficial ownership data. This is what we expect to see within the UN Tax Convention process. Rules on how we will tax the wealthy, how we will exchange data about who the wealthy are. We expect those rules would be discussed at the UN Tax Convention process, agreed upon, and countries make firm commitments, and there is a process to do a follow-up on those commitments at member state level. And therefore, the complementarity of these processes is establish the broader principles and make member states commit, but then you need rules to actualize those commitments, take it to the UN, where you have a continuous process that allows the participation of member states, that allows the participation of experts, that allows the participation of civil society organizations, have them discuss those rules at that level, agree on them, commit on them, and come up with a process of analyzing the implementation of those rules and holding each other to account. So indeed, complementary processes that cannot, one cannot run without the other. Both are very important. Thanks for that question.
Thanks, Francis, very much for a very comprehensive response, and to ensuring that everyone that's in the room and participating in the FfD process as well can leverage the interventions and evidence to participate in the UN Tax Convention, one which will take a bit longer to be negotiated. We are very close to the end of our webinar, so I'll just ask a final round of intervention from our distinguished speakers, with around 3 minutes, 4 minutes each in the interest of time and honoring our attendees. So if I may start with you, Kari, I wanted to ask you to comment. I think Francis talked about this a bit on the what are so-called enablers of corruption and on financial crime. Like their accountants or lawyers, that they play a role in facilitating corruption schemes or money laundering. So how do you think they can be allies in supporting integrity in the financial system rather than enablers of tax abuse? And tying to these, if in 1 minute, in one phrase, what do you like to see as part of the FfD committee's conversations and the outcome document?
Thank you for this question. I think it's a really important one, because we often put professional service providers a little bit in a box when we're talking about corruption, and we say, okay, they're one of the stakeholders that can help facilitate the movement of proceeds of corruption. But we really need to differentiate between the actions of professionals who maybe are capitalizing on policy or regulatory weaknesses to enhance the profitability of their clients' legal businesses as clients come to them for advice. And maybe that requires different solutions than those who are supporting the advancement of criminal enterprises. But we know that across the board, professional service providers because they have strategic access to financial markets, the people who might be engaged in illicit schemes and specific knowledge on how those schemes operate. They're really well equipped to help disrupt and prevent the schemes from occurring. They have a wealth of knowledge and experience that can be leveraged. They can play an essential role in verifying information to help ensure transparency of corporate actors. UNODC undertook a study over the last 2 years broadly on beneficial ownership transparency as part of the mandate received in Resolution 9.7, as mentioned by Emmanuel, to which 55 countries responded. And there's great examples in there regarding service providers, even though that wasn't the main focus of the study. So for instance, in Austria and Portugal, reporting systems for beneficial ownership information allow reporting by legal professionals on behalf of their clients, which helps to contribute to the accuracy of reported data. In countries like Brazil and Cyprus, the creation of a company requires the services of lawyers who not only verify documents of incorporation, but also beneficial ownership data. In Slovakia, which I think is a well-known example, but the Register of Public Sector Partners, which includes 90% of the most economically significant companies, is supplied only with information submitted by authorized persons like professional service providers who carry out pre-verification of beneficial ownership information. The regulations require that they act independently from the partner that they're verifying, and the verification documents are available on the register showing how the beneficial owner was identified and checked by the authorized person. So in these contexts, you have service providers who are both serving their clients and playing a key verification role. They can similarly play a key reporting role, helping to expose wrongdoing and cooperating with anti-corruption and law enforcement authorities. In several of the big corruption cases that we can think of in recent years, it was often professional service providers who came forward and identified irregularities in financial statements and raised concerns about the actions of their clients. And I think to be true allies in this, we also need to make sure that we're meeting the work that we might require of them or expect of them with our action. So if we want to see professional service providers playing a key reporting role as whistleblowers, then we have to ensure that they have clear and accessible channels for reporting corruption, and that we've put in place effective systems to address the reports that we receive. So we need strong protection measures and mechanisms that are well implemented and work in practice to protect and shield them from retaliation. Service providers like lawyers can also advise companies on compliance with anti-corruption regulations, and accountants can of course help trace financial flows and enable law enforcement to better understand complex schemes. And we've seen in recent years in asset recovery strategies a push to include information on how law enforcement agencies can collaborate with various stakeholders, including those that we would call enablers or professional service providers. And these strategies not only lay out requirements for professional service providers like enhanced due diligence and compliance standards, but also how they can better coordinate with law enforcement and measures for strengthening that cooperation. And if I had to sort of put it all in one phrase, I would say that anti-corruption is essential for securing the future of development financing. And I think that the only way that we can effectively mobilize financial resources and ensure that they're safeguarded for development is by including in the 4th Financing for Development Conference and investing in proven anti-corruption measures, one of which, of course, is beneficial ownership transparency. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carrie, for this encouraging, energizing last phrase. Emmanuel, if I may ask you in 1 minute, what do you think should the FfD process should focus on, and what should be really, really in the outcome document, as per your take? Oh, I'm sorry, you're... Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that we have met very good progress since 2021 when we had resolution 9/7, and then we followed that up only last year with resolution 10/6, and where we try to improve or the commitments that were made by member states in 9/7. Not before 2021 did we ever envisage that we'll be having the kind of conversation that we have now. And what was also important was the kind of improvement we made from what we achieved in 2021, in 2023, from 9/7 to 10/6. So looking forward, I want to believe not just the FfD conference that is coming up, but the negotiation and the process of having a new tax architecture at the UN should benefit from most of those issues. Talking about issues of getting all countries to maintain beneficial ownership register, issues of getting all countries to elaborate and have a common understanding of what they understand and the common meaning of beneficial ownership. And also, most importantly, the process and the institutional arrangement that would allow domestic law enforcement authorities the ability to actually collect information, not just about the beneficial ownership register as it were, but information about historical records of any beneficial owner that information is being requested upon. This is what we are already trying to do in Nigeria, and I hope that this particular improvement, especially in 10/6, could actually influence what will be the outcome document of the FfD holding next year. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Francis, may I go to you? In one phrase, what would you like to see take part of the conversations of the FfD committees and the outcome document?
Commitments, and I hope that we'll be able to take the conversation further. We have made commitments previously on tackling IFFs. We are in a new decade of IFFs. IFFs, how they are manifesting has changed. I hope we can see that. But I also hope that as part of the commitments that we will see a commitment from member states to, number one, systematically collect data. This is information around taxpayers, around beneficial ownership, but also to systematically see a process of analyzing that data, exchanging that data with international partners, and we hope that we can see some commitments to establishing rules for how this kind of data will be exchanged, but also agencies cooperating with each other. This is commitments from member states to ensure that at the domestic level agencies, there's interagency cooperation, but even when it comes to the international level, we see more cooperation between the different agencies, whether it is assets recovery agencies, whether it is companies, registration bureaus or registrars of companies, having more interagency cooperation around these issues is going to be very key. And therefore, in tackling IFFs, moving forward, apart from seeing a firm commitment around international tax cooperation, more data, how it is analyzed, how it is collected, how it is going to be exchanged is going to be very key in moving forward. Thank you.
Excellent points, Francis. We hope to see that as well. Last but not least, Camilo, what's your one phrase for the FfD process and the outcome documents?
Well, I think we should talk about capacity building. I mean, picking up from our last panelist talking about data change, we need some capacity building for digital public infrastructure, at least in Latin America. You know, we have these isolated information systems that never exchange data, and we have these isolated controlling authorities and anti-corruption authorities that are working for themselves every time, but they don't cooperate. They haven't learned to collaborate among, you know, even within the same country, they do not collaborate very peacefully. So we need that. And then we will need some collaboration and cooperation at the cross-border level, right, international level. But in order to do that, we need the digital public infrastructure to make it possible. That's what we are doing from CAF. That's what we are trying to achieve across the region, at least the Latin American region. And of course, our knowledge about digital transformation could be of use of any other stakeholder that is taking part of the conference, right? But I think that should be a very paramount topic in the conference. Thank you very much.
Well, fantastic use of time. Thank you so much for your interventions. I want to keep with this about the importance of the interagency cooperation, leveraging existing networks, countries coming together, exchanging data, addressing systemic challenges, just as climate adaptation and financing and corruption, which erodes investments and prevents the expansion of the tax base. But really having data, heavy data standards and data collection to measure progress and evaluate effectiveness around data sharing mechanisms to enforce tax policies and interoperable data systems where beneficial ownership transparency reforms and corporate registers are integrated within broader digital transformation projects in which data can come together, create information and inform decision making. So we really hope that the financing for development process in the road to Seville next year can account for the many topics that we discussed today, in enhancing beneficial ownership transparency as a cross-cutting issue, not only to enforce tax, but also to mobilize domestic resources, to ensuring transparency in trade agreements, in debt sustainability, and in general in sustainable development. So thank you for those that kept with us for the whole webinar. We really hope to continue chatting and collaborating in the process. And thanks more especially to our distinguished panelists, which their interventions made the webinar what it was, a fantastic set of interventions and very deep discussions. So thank you, and looking forward to engaging again. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye, thank you.